I do want to pick up on a point I heard the ranking member make earlier, and I think some of my colleagues, with respect to President Trump's despicable statements about the Somali community here in the United States. And it is just the latest attack on a minority community in our country. You know, if you look at the United States Senate above the dais, it says e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And what Donald Trump is doing is just the opposite. And it's despicable here at home. And he has also maligned the countries of origin of so many of our communities here in the United States. So I have to say, as we talk about Africa, it is difficult to do so without noting our extreme disappointment in the President of the United States. I want to talk about a particular country in Africa,
What you're witnessing in this clip is not simply political grandstanding or partisan theater. This is the clarion voice of moral clarity ringing through the marble halls of the Senate, at a moment when the very soul of American democracy stands imperiled by a demagogue who trades in the oldest and most venomous currency of authoritarian politics, which is to say the systematic dehumanization of entire communities based upon nothing more than their ethnicity, their religion, and the accident of their geographic origin. Senator Chris Van Hollen, standing there above that Latin inscription e pluribus unum, out of many one, is articulating something that should shake us to our very foundations, because what we're watching unfold in real time is not merely another policy disagreement or another round of partisan bickering. What we're watching is the wholesale abandonment of the foundational myth of American pluralism, that beautiful if imperfect promise that this nation could be something more than blood and soil nationalism, could be something transcendent and inclusive and predicated upon shared values rather than shared ancestry. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand what's happening right now, and I mean right now as in this very week, because Trump just stood before crowds in Pennsylvania and called Somalia and other nations hellholes while declaring that Somalis should be out of here because all they do is complain, and this comes on the heels of Trump ending a cabinet meeting by describing Somali immigrants as garbage and saying we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Think about that language for a moment. Really let it settle into your consciousness, because we're talking about a sitting president of the United States using the terminology of refuse and waste to describe human beings, American citizens in many cases. Republicans and others have largely given up on policing Trump's xenophobic rhetoric, and things that were shocking in the first term are commonplace and seemingly unremarkable today. The historical echoes here should terrify anyone with even a cursory understanding of 20th century European history, because this is precisely how fascist movements construct the ideological scaffolding necessary for mass persecution. You begin by linguistically severing the targeted group's connection to the national body politic. You strip them of their humanity through language that reduces them to contaminants or parasites, or in this case literal garbage. And once you've successfully dehumanized them in the public imagination, then the policy apparatus of state violence becomes not only thinkable, but morally justifiable in the minds of those who've internalized this toxic rhetoric. Trump's rhetorical attacks on immigrants have been building since he called Mexicans rapists during his campaign announcement a decade ago, and he's echoed rhetoric once used by Adolf Hitler, and what we're seeing now represents an escalation, a doubling down, an absolute abandonment of even the pretense of democratic norms. Here's what you need to grasp about the Somali community specifically, because this isn't random. This is strategic targeting of a Muslim immigrant population that Trump and his white nationalist advisors, led by Stephen Miller, have identified as politically expedient scapegoats. In 2024, there were nearly 260,000 people of Somali descent living in the United States, and more than 108,000 of them resided in Minnesota, and Minnesota 58% of Somali residents are U.S.-born, while 87% of the foreign-born Somalis are naturalized citizens, which means we're talking overwhelmingly about American citizens, people who've built lives here, who contribute to their communities, who are taxpayers and business owners and parents, and yet Trump stands there flanked by his cabinet and declares they should be removed, expelled, ethnically cleansed from the American landscape. The pretext Trump is using, and you always need a pretext for authoritarian persecution, is fraud schemes targeting social service programs in Minnesota, where more than 90% of those charged are of Somali descent, including 72 of 78 defendants in the Feeding Our Future case, though the alleged ringleader was a white American woman. Now think about the perverse logic at work here, because Trump is taking criminal conduct by specific individuals and using it to indict an entire ethnic and religious community. mirroring a broader trend of the Trump administration using the criminal conduct of individuals as a pretext to target an entire immigrant community, which is textbook collective punishment, a concept so fundamentally at odds with liberal jurisprudence and basic notions of justice that its use by American officials should provoke constitutional crisis. And let's be absolutely clear about what Ilhan Omar, who Trump has obsessively targeted, said in response, because Omar said on CBS that it's unfair to blame the entire community for the actions of a relative few, that most Somalis are angry about the fraud, and that we are also taxpayers in Minnesota who could have benefited from the program and the money that was stolen, which is the only rational response to this situation. You prosecute criminals, you don't ethnically cleanse entire communities. But Trump isn't interested in proportionate justice. He's interested in spectacle, in the theater of cruelty, in demonstrating to his base that he will go further than any previous president in targeting the racialized other that they've been trained to fear. Now here's where this gets even more insidious and dangerous, because the Trump administration has banned travel from 19 different countries, including Somalia, and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said her agency will be targeting visa fraud in Minnesota, where around 87,000 people with Somali roots live, which means we're looking at coordinated federal action aimed at a specific ethnic community. And Tom Homan, the federal border czar, said there will be an increase in ICE activity in Minnesota amid reported ongoing federal immigration operations targeting the Somali community. This is state power being mobilized, not against criminal activity broadly defined, but against a community, against a people, and the fact that this doesn't produce mass protests in the streets tells you how normalized Trump's fascistic tendencies have become. Senator Van Hollen is absolutely correct to invoke e pluribus unum at this moment, because that motto represents everything Trump is actively working to destroy: the promise that America could forge unity from diversity, that it could transcend the blood nationalism that has drenched Europe in carnage for centuries, that it could create something genuinely new in the human political experiment. Trump is doing the opposite. He's taking many, and rendering them not one, but fragmented, balkanized, at war with one another, and he's doing so deliberately because authoritarian politics requires an enemy, requires someone to blame for every social ill, requires a scapegoat upon which to project the anxieties and economic insecurities of a working class that has been systematically abandoned by neoliberal capitalism. The targeting of the Somali community sits at the intersection of multiple forms of oppression, and we need to name them all explicitly, because this is simultaneously about anti-blackness, about Islamophobia, about xenophobia, and about the particular vulnerability of refugee communities. Somalia became a failed state in large part because of Cold War machinations and great power intervention, and now Trump turns around and uses that instability as justification for excluding Somalis from refuge, which represents a grotesque form of circular logic where you destabilize a region through imperial policy and then punish the people displaced by that destabilization. Many Somalis began immigrating to Minnesota in the 1990s amid a civil war, and Somali citizens were first granted TPS status in 1991 under George H.W. Bush because extraordinary conditions prevented them from returning safely, with TPS status extended or redesignated 27 times since then, which tells you that for 3 decades under administrations of both parties, the United States recognized that Somalia was unsafe for return, and now Trump wants to terminate that protection. Let's talk about what Trump said specifically, because Trump asked why we don't get immigrants from Denmark, saying send us some nice people, but instead we always take people from Somalia, places that are a disaster, filthy, dirty, disgusting, ridden with crime. The only thing they're good at is going after ships, which is just nakedly racist white supremacist ideology expressed without euphemism or coded language. He's literally saying he wants white immigrants from Scandinavia instead of black and brown immigrants from Africa. He's articulating a hierarchy of human worth based on national origin and race, and this should be generating the kind of political firestorm that topples administrations, but instead, back in Trump's first term, more than 20 Republican senators expressed disappointment when he reportedly called certain nations shithole countries, but now Republicans have given up policing his rhetoric. And yes, Trump has now finally admitted that he did call some countries, including heavily black ones, shithole countries back in 2018, effectively admitting that he and prominent Republicans were extremely dishonest about the episode when they claimed he didn't use such language. This week, Trump embraced the term as he boasted about pausing immigration from hellholes like Afghanistan, Haiti, Somalia, and many other countries, and when someone in the audience yelled shithole, Trump quipped, "I didn't say shithole, you did," which is the fascist playbook. You say the quiet part loud. You normalize the previously unthinkable. You move the Overton window so far to the right that literal ethnic slurs become acceptable presidential discourse. What Senator Van Hollen is doing in this clip is what every Democratic senator and representative should be doing, which is naming this for what it is, calling it despicable, calling it un-American, tying it to the systematic pattern of Trump attacking minority communities, whether it's Mexicans or Muslims or Haitians or Somalis or anyone who doesn't fit the white Christian nationalist vision of authentic America. Ilhan Omar noted in a New York Times opinion column that when Trump maligns her, it increases the number of death threats that her family and staff members receive, which means this rhetoric has material consequences. It translates into violence, into hate crimes, into the terrorization of vulnerable communities, and we need to connect this to the broader architecture of Trumpian white nationalism, because Omar said Trump exhibits an unhealthy obsession on the Somali community and called out Stephen Miller, whose rhetoric she likened to the language Nazis used against German Jews, to which Miller responded that the entire Somali refugee program is predicated on a lie, and that destroying your own country does not give you the right to become a citizen in ours, which is Miller speaking, the architect of family separation, the architect of the Muslim ban, the man who has dedicated his career to constructing a legal and policy framework for white nationalism. The fact that someone with Miller's ideology has this much power in shaping American immigration policy should terrify anyone who believes in pluralistic democracy. Now I want you to understand the mechanism of collective punishment being deployed here, because while the alleged ringleader of Feeding Our Future fraud was white, many defendants were Somalis, and most of them were U.S. citizens fueling Trump administration scrutiny of the entire community, and several other fraud cases involving Medicaid and autism programs came out implicating members of the Somali community. But here's the crucial point that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said his agency will investigate allegations that stolen money may have been diverted to al-Shabaab militants. Similar claims surfaced in 2018 about a child care program, but weren't substantiated by investigators, and federal prosecutors have rejected claims linking defendants to terrorists, with none facing terrorism financing charges. So they're floating terrorism connections without evidence. They're using McCarthyite tactics to smear an entire community, and the media largely just reports these allegations without sufficient skepticism or context. Let me tell you what's actually happening here, from a structural perspective, because what Trump has done is taken the normal American response to crime, which is individualized prosecution, and replaced it with collective targeting, based on ethnicity, treating the fraud case not as what it was, a criminal prosecution against specific individuals, but as a moral indictment of an entire ethnic community, casting Minnesota's Somali population as a contagion, undermining the state and country from within. This is how you construct the ideological justification for ethnic cleansing. You pathologize the targeted group, you present them as an invasive species threatening the national organism, and then removal becomes not persecution but prophylaxis, not cruelty but common sense. And the response from the Somali community has been remarkable, because Somalis and Somali Americans have rejected Trump's characterization with outrage and creative mockery that lit up social media, with some users creating AI-generated images, inserting Somalis into iconic images from U.S. history, and others parodying Zionist claims to Palestine by joking that Minnesota was promised to them 3,000 years ago, which is using humor as resistance, using satire to expose the absurdity of nativist claims in a nation built by immigration and on stolen indigenous land. The fact that a community under attack can respond with this kind of wit and creativity tells you something about their resilience, about their refusal to internalize the dehumanization being directed at them. Senator Van Hollen is connecting Trump's domestic bigotry to his foreign policy, noting how Trump has maligned African countries of origin, and this is crucial because Trump has long opposed immigration to Western countries, often using harsh rhetoric to target immigrants specifically from African and Muslim-majority countries. And this represents a consistent ideological through-line, a worldview premised on civilizational hierarchy, on the belief that some peoples and cultures are inherently superior to others, which is the urtext of colonial and fascist ideology. When Trump talks about wanting immigrants from Norway instead of Somalia, he's not engaging in policy analysis. He's articulating racial preference. He's advocating for America to become whiter. The implications of normalizing this discourse cannot be overstated, because, as Cesar Cuauhtémoc Garcia Hernández, a civil rights law professor, noted, Trump specializes in pushing the boundaries of what others have done before. He is far from the first politician to embrace race-baiting xenophobia, but as President of the United States he has more impact than most. And domestically, Trump has remarkable loyalty among Republicans, while internationally he embodies an aspiration for like-minded politicians and intellectuals. This is the terrifying thing. Trump isn't an aberration. He's a model. He's demonstrating to would-be authoritarians worldwide that you can say these things, you can implement these policies, and not only will you not be punished, but you can win elections. You can consolidate power. You can remake the state apparatus in service of ethnic nationalism. The historical parallel that keeps surfacing in my mind is the Nuremberg laws, the way the Nazi regime incrementally stripped Jews of citizenship, of property rights, of personhood, and each step seemed small in isolation, seemed justifiable under some bureaucratic or legal pretext, but cumulatively they created the conditions for genocide. I'm not saying we're there yet. I'm saying that the logic Trump is deploying, the rhetoric he's using, the policies he's advocating, they sit on that continuum. They're drawing from that same ideological well, and anyone who's studied the history of state violence against minorities knows that you ignore the early warning signs at your mortal peril. Van Hollen references the fundamental principle of e pluribus unum, and Trump is offering its antithesis, which we might call ex uno pluris, from one many, the fragmentation of the national community into warring factions defined by race and religion and national origin, and this fragmentation serves specific political purposes because it prevents the kind of cross-racial working-class solidarity that could challenge oligarchic power. As long as working-class white Americans believe that their economic precarity is caused by Somali immigrants rather than by Wall Street and corporate extraction, as long as they can be convinced that the threat comes from refugees rather than from the billionaire class that's strip-mining the social safety net, then Trump and his ilk can continue to govern on behalf of capital while deploying the rhetoric of populism. This is why it matters so much that Democrats like Van Hollen are speaking out forcefully, because Van Hollen says his party must do more to regain public confidence and counter what he calls a lawless president, acknowledging that Democrats have become too much the party of the status quo when people want to see them move in a different direction, and they need to be clear about what they're fighting for, not just what they're fighting against. This is exactly right. It's necessary but insufficient to simply oppose Trump's bigotry. You have to offer an affirmative vision of multiracial democracy, of economic justice, of a society where dignity and security are available to everyone regardless of where they were born. The despicable nature of Trump's attacks on the Somali community cannot be disentangled from the broader context of American Islamophobia, because the Brennan Center identifies how Trump and his White House staff and advisors have targeted Muslims through both speech and policy in at least 5 forms, including anti-Muslim rhetoric, elevation of Islamophobic staff, the ban on visitors from Muslim-majority countries, extreme vetting procedures, and lack of response to hate crimes targeted at Muslims, and this represents systematic religious persecution using the apparatus of state power. When Trump implemented the Muslim ban, which on January 27, 2017, banned travelers and refugees from 7 Muslim-majority countries, including Somalia, Somalia, Basawar Aftas, he was sending a clear message about whose lives matter, about who belongs in America, about which religious traditions are compatible with American identity and which aren't. And we now know that dozens of Muslim organizations have been stripped of their eligibility for FEMA security funds that help protect against hate crimes and extremist attacks after DHS and DOJ allege the groups have ties to terrorism, with 5 FEMA insiders describing those allegations as questionable and suggesting they may be a pretext to justify the cuts, which means that even as Muslim institutions face increased threats because of Trump's rhetoric, his administration is denying them resources for security. This is the cruelty being the point. This is governance as sadism. This is the deliberate infliction of harm on vulnerable communities for political gain. The fact that we're talking about this in December 2025 tells you that Trump's second term represents an escalation rather than a continuation of his first term's bigotry. When he reportedly said shithole countries during his first term, it was an international incident that drew harsh responses from Republicans, but this week when he confirmed he said it, and layered it with even more xenophobia, it was just a Tuesday. The normalization is the point. The gradual erosion of democratic norms is the strategy, and each transgression that goes unchallenged becomes the new baseline from which further transgressions can be launched. What we're witnessing is nothing less than an attempt to redefine American national identity along explicitly ethno-nationalist lines, to repudiate the civic nationalism that has however imperfectly characterized American self-understanding and replace it with blood and soil nationalism that says you can't truly be American unless you're white and Christian and native-born. This is what Trump means when he says certain communities should get the hell out, even when they're citizens, even when they've built lives here, even when this is the only home they've ever known. He's saying that citizenship is contingent, that it can be revoked, that membership in the national community depends not on legal status or shared values, but on ethnic and religious identity. And the response from Minnesota has been noteworthy, because Minneapolis officials pushed back against the administration's rhetoric, saying the city would stand by the Somali community, which is what local resistance looks like, which is sanctuary policies in action, which is elected officials using whatever power they have to protect vulnerable residents from federal overreach. This is where the fight happens, in cities and states, with governors and mayors and prosecutors who refuse to cooperate with Trump's deportation machine, who refuse to participate in the targeting of ethnic and religious minorities. But we can't just rely on local resistance. We need a coordinated national movement that understands what's at stake here, that recognizes Trump's attacks on the Somali community as part of a broader assault on pluralistic democracy, that sees the connections between his immigration policies and his attacks on voting rights, and his embrace of white nationalism, and his willingness to deploy state violence against protesters. These aren't separate issues, they're all manifestations of the same authoritarian impulse, the same desire to consolidate power in the hands of a narrow elite by dividing and conquering everyone else. Senator Van Hollen, standing there invoking e pluribus unum, is doing more than rhetoric. He's articulating a counter-vision. He's saying that America's meaning and promise lie precisely in its diversity, in its capacity to bring together people from every corner of the earth and forge them into a single democratic community. This is the America worth fighting for, the America that Trump is trying to destroy, the America that has never fully existed, but might yet be achieved if we're willing to struggle for it. The question before us now is whether we have the political courage and moral clarity to resist this descent into fascism, because that's what we're talking about. That's the stakes of this moment. Are we going to normalize presidential rhetoric that describes entire ethnic and religious communities as garbage, as refuse, as contaminants that need to be expelled? Are we going to accept collective punishment as legitimate policy? Are we going to stand by while American citizens are terrorized by their own government because of their ancestry or their faith? Or are we going to say enough? Are we going to build the kind of mass movement that can check authoritarian power, that can defend the vulnerable, that can create a truly multiracial democracy where everyone has dignity and security and the possibility of flourishing? This clip should be played on loop. It should be required viewing. It should spark the kind of national conversation that forces us to confront what we're becoming as a country. Senator Van Hollen is offering moral witness. He's speaking truth to power. He's refusing to let Trump's despicable attacks go unchallenged. And every Democrat, every person who claims to believe in justice and equality, needs to follow his lead. We need more senators standing up on the floor and naming this bigotry for what it is, more representatives making this the central issue of our political moment, more people in the streets demanding that refugee communities be protected, that Islamophobia be rejected, that white nationalism be defeated. The arc of the moral universe doesn't bend toward justice automatically. It bends because people bend it, because movements form and demand change, because ordinary citizens decide they will not be complicit in atrocity. Trump is testing us. He's seeing how much degradation we'll tolerate, how much cruelty we'll accept, how far he can push before encountering meaningful resistance. And our response in this moment will determine whether American democracy survives or whether it devolves into authoritarian ethno-nationalism. Senator Van Hollen is showing us what resistance looks like, what moral courage sounds like, what it means to invoke the founding principles of this republic against their systematic betrayal, and we need to match his courage with our own action, our own organizing, our own unwavering commitment to building the beloved community that Trump and his ilk are trying to destroy.